Okay, welcome back to Russian Domain Part 3. I think for many of us, this can be a very Russia geopolitics. It's kind of the epitome of geopolitics and understanding geopolitical relationships. And if you think back to your mental map, and I asked you what's the relationship that we have with this region and the United States? What is our political situation like? If any of you guys are familiar with much of the news, read the news, even just Facebook headlines. First of all, if you don't read the news, I highly recommend you start being more familiar about what's going on in the world. But most of you probably are very well aware to some extent that we have a very interesting relationship with Russia today. And I'm assuming most of you should know that we have a very conflictive history with Russia, especially over the last 100 years, or Russia as being the USSR, the Soviet Union. So understanding Russia today partly involves understanding the communist era, the USSR. It's not that all of a sudden the USSR ceased to exist because the government was overthrown. The USSR ceased to exist, as we'll talk about, basically because countries were the republics that consisted of the Russia of the United or this of the USSR were basically allowed to become autonomous, which is what happened. So there wasn't necessarily a government overthrow. And if you follow much of Russian politics, you kind of question, well, is anything really different? There's a lot of stuff in the news. If you've followed the news at all over the last couple of years, the Trump administration has had a long, cloudy, maybe? I'm sorry, I'm trying to find a nice I try not to let my own politics influence what I say to students, but cloudy, murky. I mean, obviously in the U.S. government or different branches of the government, different institutions have been investigating the involvement of Russia in various election issues. So it's a very murky relationship, however you want to define it, with the Trump administration in Russia as well. So much of what we see regarding geopolitics of Russia today, we're seeing this long-standing legacy of the former Soviet Union. So again, not necessarily a colonial legacy, but a legacy of the Soviet Union. Since about the year 2000, there's been a series of political resurgence movements. Russia has largely regained and maintained. So remember, the end of the Soviet Union was 1991. So about 10 years later, the playing field started changing again. We saw this huge political resurgence. So geopolitically speaking, there's regional dominance of Russia within this region, which again, when we go back and think about why domain, why are these countries clumped in with Russia? Again, that's part of this. And this is also evident in the recent events in the Ukraine over the last several years. And then Russia has been very strategic. There's also a lot of involvement with Russia in Syria and civil war as well. But with the Ukraine, it's technically been labeled as a civil war per se. But Russia has provides supplies for the Russian loyalists within the country. The rebels per se, but they're technically within Ukraine. And Russia, if we forget about the Crimean Peninsula, has technically not invaded Ukraine. Technicalities, the art of dancing in geopolitics. And then again, there's perspective or possible isolation. What will Russia do as other countries? The Trump administration will congratulate putting on different quote unquote achievements or re-elections, for example. But then at the same time, our government and governments around the world in the Western world will sanction Russia. They will, trade sanctions, tax sanctions. They are also, there's a history of embargoes. So it's a weird, contradictory situation. So what will Russia do in the future? We don't know. Will Russia return to an isolated stance? Will Russia turn east to China? Quite possible as well. So this is kind of a region where we don't know, but the we don't know what is kind of going on and what will go on in the future is important because there's so much going on at the same time. Um, to give you a brief background, so again, I mentioned we had the Tsars, then we had the Bolshevik Revolution. God, to remember, so I can't remember 1914 or 1919. So we had the Bolshevik Revolution, which basically labors that throughout the Tsars. If everybody remembers the story of Anastasia and her three sisters, there were four little girls. I can't remember if there's a little boy or not. Um, and I think it was maybe in the 60s, 40s. I can't actually remember the date at all. But somebody came back at some point claiming to have been the little girl Anastasia, and they determined that it wasn't, that Anastasia had died during the Bolshevik Revolution. But the Bolshevik Revolution adopted a communist strategy. So the government quickly became communist, again relying on Karl Marx. So I asked you to watch the video in the previous lecture. And then the first main leader of the Communist Party was Lenin, and followed by Stalin later. So the USSR consisted of 15 republics. These republics were largely ethnic based. So Armenia is largely Armenians. Moldova, actually, I'm not sure how to say Moldova. Belarus, for example, Belarusians. Turkmenistan's. So what we saw was these autonomous areas. They were technically republics. They were part of the USSR. They were, quote unquote, allowed certain types of autonomy, but it was very limited. So during the Stalin period, we saw the exclave of Kaliningrad was formed. We saw, as we talked about with Europe, the Iron Curtain and the progression of the Cold War after World War II. Towards the end of the Soviet Union, we saw growth in ethnic nationalism. So this was after World War II. And this is what really led to, again, the ethnic groups already existed, but by the concepts of nationalism being that there's a sense of us versus them, that they wanted to have their own land and their own borders. And I'm not going to go over too much of the Soviet politics. Your book goes into it much more. Basically, so you can understand a little bit more towards the demise. As I talked about briefly before, where it's not like the government was overthrown or there was a war. It just kind of stopped. So Gorbachev, who was the last leader, there was this concept. So again, the USSR typically officially was ended in 1991. It was based largely on this Gorbachev policy called Glasnost, which there was a lot of pressure coming from the different republics to have more freedom. So basically, is what he did was, it was this period of greater political openness, is the best way to translate it, throughout the 80s, where they were allowed more freedoms. And there's this concept called perestroika, which is basically a series of economic reforms that moved away from the planned centralized economy. So basically, during the USSR, you had one centralized government who made all of the decisions for everywhere. Over time, you basically saw more autonomy and freedoms given to the different republics. Basically, it got to the point where the republics were like, oh, okay, well, we don't want to be part of the USSR anymore. It's a really interesting, but it's these, the perestroika and the glasnost, which were ultimately the demise of the USSR. So this is not to say today there's not a lot of geopolitical issues. You've got over here between Japan and Russia, the Kuril Islands. There's still a lot of conflict over those disputes over whether or not they belong to the Japanese or the Russians. Chechnya has been very characteristic for a lot of violence, ethnic violence. Groups trying to reestablish control, Russia not wanting to give up control. So in a lot of the other countries too, and as we see with Ukraine, Russia illegally occupied the Crimea Peninsula, which is right down here. It was about 4 years ago, 5 years ago now, it was 2014. And then again, this has led to more or less what we'd refer to as a civil war within the country, a dispute, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So you can see there's a lot of conflict around it, partially ethnic conflict, and partially it's a lot of geopolitical. It's a question of power. And again, this goes back to a long-standing history. Part of understanding that is understanding, and we don't necessarily talk about colonization, but in some ways it is a type of colonization if you go back and think about the Russification, right? So relationships, more modern relationships. There was a Commonwealth of Independent States, which is kind of like an EU type of effort in some ways. It was the previous system. It failed. Today there's the Eurasian Economic Union. It's kind of like an EU notion. It's more recent. It's a customs union for trade. So you have Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan. So not just countries, they're former Soviet countries. We've got Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, which are part of Central Asia, that are part of the Union as well. So I want to give you a little bit more information about the crisis in Ukraine. So state being country, it's a very politically unstable state. Culturally speaking, it's a very divided state. So the Crimean Peninsula down there is the kind of purplish, bluish color. That's a Russian-occupied land. The red and the orange on the east are they're rebel proclaimed and they're rebel controlled areas. So by having the rebels claiming this region, that's where it kind of becomes more of a civil war. And then you've got the striped areas or Russian zones that are impacted by refugees who are fleeing these areas. So culturally speaking, you have Ukrainians and you have ethnic Russians that have been living in Ukraine. And we'll talk about this here on the next slide. So basically there's just three major factors. So since its creation, Ukraine has been pretty divided politically and stable. So some of the population prefer to keep the connection with Russia, and others prefer to look for a European connection, so trade and political relationships. 2010, there was an election. President Yanukovych had a strong relationship with Putin, and he refused to consider any type of relationship with the European Union. However, protesters, a series of protests throughout the country, they forced him out in 2011. And then there was another election a few years later. And President Poroshenko, he was pro-EU. So he all of a sudden dropped the Russian side and went for the European side, therefore basically pissing off the ethnic Russians and the people who were Russian loyalists. So we've seen this long-standing regional divide between Ukrainians and Russians, and a lot of this can go back to issues stemming from Russification. So we see Russia's expansive geopolitical ambition. So Russia within itself, they illegally occupied the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, and then they have been providing economic and military support for the rebels who are Russian loyalists in the eastern part of Ukraine. So this has resulted in now what we have a civil war, meaning by a civil war, and other countries aren't supposed to get involved in other countries' internal conflict, we don't get involved. So by mid-2015, it was declared a civil war. About more than 6,000 people were dead, and there were 1.5 refugees and internally displaced people. There have been several ceasefire agreements over the years, but they've largely failed. And so that's kind of where it's at still today. So just a couple other geopolitical hotspots. I'm not going to go into these, but you can go ahead and read these in your book. They go into quite a bit. This sums up a lot of them. So geopolitics within Russia. We talked quite a bit about what the USSR was, the Soviet Union. Today, there's 21 republics that make up the Russian Federation. In some of these regions, we have a lot of pressures for devolution. Does anybody remember what devolution is? This is a quiz. This is an exam question on your final exam. So devolution is basically you're looking for independence movements within the country. You want more autonomous power, and then ideally to get to a point where you are your own independent country within the country. However, Putin has been going back to more of a centralized control, so going back to much more like a central government, a unitary government, where not like what we have in the States, where we have a federal government, there is a central government, it oversees a lot of the national laws, but at the same time, states are very independent and autonomous. So he's looking for much more centralized control of the country. This has resulted in a lot of quote unquote challenges for civil liberties. So we don't have I'm going to forget the name of it. I don't remember the name of the DKG. There's a Russian, it was like a militant police force. They worked for the Communist Party. I cannot remember what they were called. Um, but anyways, so today there's a concept called the Siloviki, the military and security forces. So there is still a similar concept. I don't know if anybody's heard of the Pussy Riot. They were females that I believe are mostly still imprisoned. They were banned. They had a music group and they were speaking out against the government. So by what I mean with more centralized control, this basically has resulted in limited press freedoms, silencing critics, not just critics, authors, professors, academics, can't think of the word in English, sorry, people who write for newspapers, reporters, control of media outlets, internet surveillance as well, and then overall that generally results in a loss of democratic freedoms for people. So again, kind of looking to see what could happen and what could continue to happen because it's a very big part of the world today. They have a lot of political power, trying to figure out what's going on and what will go on. We're seeing closer relations with China. As I mentioned, there's still territorial disputes with Japan over the Kuril Islands, for example. They have their concern regarding the expansion of NATO. So Kaliningrad which is that little exclave we talked about in the middle of Europe. It's surrounded by NATO and European Union. Doesn't have the land bridge to Russia. And then Russia still has quite a bit of and increasing global influence. So they are on the Security Council of the United Nations. They have veto power like the United States. There is attempts to reinsert and reassert national global political status. As I said, they do have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. They have a pretty anti-American foreign policy. Again, this could be argued that it's changing back and forth. You don't really know what could happen. Sorry, a bird keeps flying in my house. And there's a nuclear arsenal as well. And then we're seeing this again to talk, as we briefly mentioned, the international relationship we have with the United States and Russia. There's definitely, Russia tries to provide a counterweight to a lot of our international actions. So what's to come? It's a really good question. It's definitely something I would encourage you guys to watch and be aware of and try to understand because this is definitely a situation that your generation will inherit as well. So what we'd see going back to, again, the legacies of the Soviet Union, part of this would be economic legacies. So there's still a very centralized economic planning within the country. A lot of the infrastructure that was developed is what is still existing today. So roads, railroads, canals. There's still very inefficient agricultural practices throughout the region. And then again, there's a lot of manufacturing, but it tends to be very low quality manufacturing as well. A couple of other things. The region is really struggling to redefine economic ties. This is a country that, they need to be able to trade. All of their neighbors pretty much were former Soviet countries, and now they no longer are. And a lot of them have been looking for independence. And I'm not just talking about political independence, but also economic trade independence as well. So this is something that is a continual issue for this country. Privatization and state control, I should say the region as well. Privatization and state control. So again, central government has a lot of state control over everything. And there's been this interesting development of privatization and how to balance that and how to make it work. And, how does that work? Again, going back to thinking about the oligarchs that we learned about on one of the first slides. How will this work? How will this continue to work? And the challenge of corruption. So this is largely tied to the previous one as well. There's little laws to control the privatization and the consumer public protection of businesses. So how do you have a capitalist market emerge? And how do you do it with a centralized government? And one of the things that we see with this region is that there's a lot of problems related to healthcare and alcoholism. Something very characteristic of this region that we don't necessarily see of other regions. A third of men, just men, not females, die before the age of 60. Cardiovascular disease is one of the largest contributors to this. There's high rates of smoking. So to the extent that your book even points out 54% of physicians themselves smoke. High rate of HIV/AIDS, again, having the government recognize this is not really happened. And there's a much higher average alcohol consumption. So on general, there's about 4 gallons of pure alcohol per person is consumed so if you're comparative, right? So for every 1.6 gallons, which is the world average, so per person, the world average is 1.6 gallons of alcohol being consumed. I'm assuming this is in a year. But you get 4 gallons, so almost 3 times as much, which is quite a difference. As we always finish off with gender, culture, and politics, this region is very conservative, very patriarchal societies. This results in a lot of violence against women, not something that we necessarily hear a lot about. Usually we hear more about this regarding sex trafficking and India, the high frequency rape that we'll talk about when we get to South Asia. But there is a lot of violence against women in this region. Human trafficking as well is a major problem for this region, as well as the sex tourism industry. Okay, so to wrap up, Russia, we're seeing more of a movement into globalized consumers. So as they continue to develop, they're consuming a lot more, including energy, a lot of changing flows of foreign investment. So especially from the United States and Japan. This is definitely something you should have heard about in the news. We're seeing declining currency values. And again, as I mentioned, economic sanctions. It's a very weird, contradictory relationship. And as we mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of natural resources as well. So petroleum, oil primarily accounts for up to 2/3 of its exports. But remember, it's not a part of OPEC. It's the world's largest natural gas exporter. They're continually expanding on more pipelines. And then again, falling oil and gas prices is continually a problem. And like, once again, they're not a part of OPEC. And they're starting to see more of a shift eastward regarding trading. So China needs oil. They're a neighbor ready to sell. And here is our review at the end. So you have it for your notes. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week.